Good evening, everyone, and welcome to 3GNY Stories Live WEDU Wednesdays. My name is Shannon Sachs, and I'm a 3GNY board member, but also a grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors. I'm pleased to be here tonight for our 8th WEDU Wednesday, which features guest speaker Emily Greenspan, who has a fascinating story to share with us tonight. For those of you who don't know, 3GNY is an educational nonprofit for children of survivors and our supporters. As a living link, we preserve the legacies and lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate diverse communities about the perils of intolerance and to provide a supportive forum for the descendants of survivors. We were founded in 2005 by a group of 6, and now 3GNY's membership exceeds 3,000 members. Over the past 15 years, we have held diverse in-person programs of all sizes around New York. 3GNY has played a leading role in launching other 3G groups, including 3GDC, 3GNJ, and we're in conversations with others around the country in an effort to launch in other states. In July, we held our first WEDU Wednesday and have been holding them every 2 weeks since we started WEDU Wednesdays. We showcase 3GNY's flagship educational program, WEDU, which is short for We Educate, and this initiative empowers grandchildren of survivors to learn and compellingly share their families' Holocaust experiences in school classrooms and with community groups. Oh, and in case you missed any of our past speakers, we record every speaker that we've had, so don't worry, all our WEDU Wednesdays can be found on our YouTube channel. All you have to do is go type in 3GNY in YouTube and you can find us there. So you can either watch us live every other Wednesday or search our archives on the YouTube channel. So now it's my pleasure to welcome my friend Dan Brooks, founder and former director of 3GNY, who will tell you a little bit more about our impactful program. And it's because of Dan that 3G exists. So I'm thankful to him and forever grateful for his vision and dedication that got us where we are today. So Dan, take it away.
Thanks so much, Shannon, and everybody for organizing this. Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Brooks. I'm so glad to be here tonight. We've all seen the heartbreaking studies on the lack of Holocaust knowledge among recent high school and college graduates. This has been in the news recently. The good news is that students who do receive Holocaust education are more tolerant and comfortable with people of different backgrounds and races. They're more willing to challenge incorrect or biased information and are more willing to be upstanders. This is why WEDU is so critical today. WEDU is a 4-week training program to teach grandchildren of survivors to learn and compellingly share their family testimony in school classrooms. 3GNY has trained over 250 speakers in New York, New Jersey, Washington, D.C., and most recently around the country on Zoom since the pandemic hit. Through our grandparents' testimony, we talk about the importance of stepping in early and often, where small injustices are found, places like on the playground, in the classroom, on the street, because it's easier here and most efficiently to act. We've reached out to over 25,000 young minds, and we know we need to do more. Our speakers have received over 1,000 thank you notes from students. I've had the honor of sharing my grandparents' stories with many students. I've seen how engaged the students are when I'm in the classroom. I've seen on their faces how impacted they are hearing these personal stories that bring to life the more general history that they've already learned. So hope is not lost, and we need to keep doing the work. You can help us accomplish this through a financial gift of any amount. This will go directly towards training more speakers, thus reaching even more students. We do not solicit donations from schools, teachers, or students. We provide our programming to schools completely free, and we aim to keep the cost of training to 3Gs as low as possible. There's a link with ways to donate in the chat, and we hope you'll consider making a gift. Thank you so much for helping us honor the memories of our grandparents and ensuring that never forget is more than just an empty phrase. I'd now like to introduce tonight's speaker, Emily Greenspan. She has a captivating story and one we know you're all eager to hear. Emily grew up with a deep connection to her family's Jewish culture And though she was fascinated by her connection to the Holocaust, she never knew the full story of what her grandparents went through until after they passed. Thanks to the Shoah Foundation, personal family research, a trip to Romania and to Poland, and the support of 3GNY, Emily was able to finally connect the dots. Like some people who carry intergenerational trauma, Emily tends toward anxiety and perfectionism. In the past few years, she learned she has a responsibility to heal herself and to prioritize her well-being above her work. Through some common, as well as less conventional routes, she's begun this healing process. Emily will share more on intergenerational trauma, and of course, will share with us her family story. Emily, we're honored to have you speak with us this evening. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much, Dan, for that generous introduction. I'm so excited to be with you all here today, and I'm so grateful for everyone who's come to hear my grandmother's story and to hear my relationship to it as well. So I'm zooming at you from the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York, which I recently learned is indigenous land to the Munsee Lenape people, who have been all but erased from this land, just as my family and Jews from all across Europe were all but erased from that continent during World War II and throughout other parts of history as well. So again, if you missed it, my name is Emily. My name begins with the letter E because I was named after my great-grandfather Eugene, who was murdered during the Holocaust. It's Jewish practice oftentimes to name a child after a descendant who has already passed. Now, Eugene actually was my grandfather's father, and I'm actually going to present the story of my grandmother, whose name was Lilly Davidovich Gutman, and she was born as Leah Davidovich. So I'm just gonna share. Oops. All right. So this is a very glamorous picture of my grandmother. She was a very glamorous woman. I have a lot of these kind of glamour shots, but I really like this one. So my grandmother changed her name when she came to the United States to Lilly because it was, I don't know, she wanted to Americanize and assimilate a little bit more, but she was born as Leah Davidovich, which is a very Jewish name. She was born in 1927, and unfortunately she passed away in 2012 when I was 17 years old. Growing up, I was very close with my grandmother. She was an incredibly warm and loving person, and yeah, she loved me very much, and I loved her very much. I knew that she had survived the Holocaust, but she never told me about it. And I was really afraid to ask. I was afraid of re-traumatizing her, of bringing up bad memories. And I think maybe the reason that she never really told me about it is maybe because she didn't want to pass on that burden to me either. And it's actually quite interesting. There's a phenomenon that's been documented called, I think it's the two-sided door or the double door phenomenon, which is where Holocaust survivors and their descendants, they both put up this door. Like the one side doesn't want to ask because they're afraid, and the other doesn't want to burden, the children or grandchildren with the trauma of the past. So growing up, I always knew that my grandmother had made this, had done this interview with the USC Shoah Foundation just after I was born. So I thought, okay, her story is documented. She did this interview. If I ever have questions one day, I can watch the tape. Unfortunately, in my teenage years, she started losing her memory. And as I started really coming into my own more and more and thinking about my family's past, about her past more and more, she began to get sicker and sicker. And, I never really felt that it was, I never felt comfortable asking what happened to her. So the Shoah Foundation tape actually really is the main thing that I use to craft this presentation. It's quite in depth. The interviewer asked her many questions about her story, and that combined with other elements of family research is what I used to put together this story. And something that the interviewer actually asked her during the interview is, why are you doing this? And to me, this is really interesting question. I mean, obviously all of the questions are interesting to me because I want to know everything, but I think this is particularly interesting because she never spoke, right? She never spoke about this to me, and really didn't speak about it to my mom much either. And when the interviewer asked her, why are you doing this? She said, for my daughter and for my grandchild. And apparently my mom at the time had kind of convinced her to do it. And she said, my grandmother said, this is a direct quote, my daughter said, Ma, you have to do this for the next generation. They have to know. She made me realize it was the right thing to do. So let me take you back in time, or transport you to this beautiful, beautiful place where my grandmother grew up. So she's from a region of what's now Romania called Transylvania, which had gone back and forth between Romania and Hungary throughout history. Her little village, this village is called Borsa, B-O-R-S-A. It's a small village, very beautiful, a lot of farmland, horses. One thing she did tell me about her past, sometimes I would ask for bedtime stories, and she would tell me about the beautiful mountains she could see from her bedroom window. She would tell me about how she would go skiing and ice skating in the winter. And she told me that she lived in a big, beautiful house. So actually, I'm incredibly fortunate that my mom and I had the chance to go to Romania pre-pandemic. We went last year. This was spring 2019. We had the chance to visit. And we found out that the house that my grandmother grew up in is still standing. Now, my grandmother, who's pictured on the right, actually returned to Romania in the 70s and found that her house was still standing and had been turned into a post office. I know the text is very small, but maybe you can see just above my grandmother and to the right, it says Posta. It's the post office. So we did a little bit of research and we found out that indeed it was still the post office, and indeed it was still standing. And that's on the left is my mom and I in front of the post office. So this is the house that my grandmother grew up in. It was a big house. It was a beautiful house. And it was located on a dairy farm that my great-grandparents, so my grandmother's parents owned. Actually, let me backtrack for a moment. So these are my great-grandparents, Lily's parents. On the left is my great-grandmother, Nisol or Nelly Davidovich. That's what it says in Hebrew. And on the right is my great-grandfather, Lazar Meyer Davidovich. That's what, again, what it says in Hebrew. So actually, Nelly's parents ran this dairy farm. They owned it, and they also owned a general store in the town. It was a small town. There wasn't too much there. So, you know, as if you've ever been to like a little town, oftentimes they'll have a general store where you can buy just about anything you might need. So they ran a general store in the town. A little bit about my great-grandparents. Being that, you know, Nelly's family owned this massive dairy, I believe they were one of like a pretty major transporter around Romania of like cheeses and milks and stuff. Joke's on me as a descendant because I am super lactose intolerant, as is my mom. Like, it's just, yeah, anyway, it seems a bit unfair, but that was their business, dairy. Anyway, being that they owned this big dairy company, dairy farm, whatever, they were quite well-to-do. So Nelly's family had a lot of money, and Lazar Meyer, her husband, was very well-educated, super, super smart guy, super kind man, but he didn't have any money. So it was that was their marriage, and they moved into Nisol or Nelly's family's house, this big, beautiful house located right on the dairy farm. Now, Nelly and Lazar Meyer, Hus, by the way, is Nelly's maiden name. So they had 6 children, right? So there were, these are all the children pictured here. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the family in general first. So my grandmother described her family as a warm family, loving family. They were religious. They celebrated Shabbat, the Jewish day of rest, on Friday, Saturday. And every Shabbat, because they were quite well-to-do, they liked to share with people in the community who weren't. Now, there's this horrible misconception that all Jews are wealthy, and this is actually a really big part of what fuels anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic hatred. It's not true. There were poor Jews in my grandmother's town. There are still poor Jews today. They're just not as represented in the media. So we don't see pictures of them as much. But in any case, they were one of the few well-to-do families in the town, and they wanted to share their, fortune with others. So they would always have other Jews over their house who couldn't afford to eat as much. They would have them over for a big Shabbat meal every Friday night. So a couple of fun little stories about this family. So Joseph was the oldest. He was very studious and quite religious. Sarah was super, super smart, involved in activism. I believe she was involved in some communist stuff. Yeah, definitely pretty radical. Bill was the person I think my grandmother was closest to, or the sibling my grandmother was closest to. Bill and Lilly, the two of them, they were like really always into shenanigans, played with a lot of animals, and just kind of were always pulling practical jokes and pranks and stuff like that. Two that I'll share that my grandmother did, actually. So one of them has to do with Sarah. So Nellie had new clothes made for Sarah. Like Sarah had custom made clothes for her. And when she outgrew them, guess who got them? Lilly. Now my grandmother really resented this. And so Nellie, being that she liked to really share with others in the community, would often ask my grandmother, Lilly, or Leah at the time was her name, why don't you take, this basket of food over to the neighbors? They really need it. So my grandmother thought she'd be extra, nice that day. And she put all of her clothes into the basket with the food, and she brought it to the neighbors. And when she came back home, she said, "Mom, I don't have anything to wear." And she said, "What are you talking about? You have all of your clothes, all of your hand-me-downs from Sarah." And she said, "Oh, I just thought the neighbors really could use them, so I gave them away." So that was one kind of wild thing she did. Another thing she did was when a couple times a year, I guess, they had family in a city nearby. And the family from the city would come and visit them and spend vacations there or whatever. And they weren't familiar with country life. So my grandmother thought it would be very funny to trick them into thinking that a cow was a horse. And they believed her. And she said, "Look at this horse. You can ride this horse." And so her cousin got up on the cow and tried to ride the cow and got kicked right off. And thankfully, the cousin was okay. But this is the kind of the shenanigans that my grandmother would get up to. She really, even, as an adult, she loved to laugh. She loved to have a good time. She was always smiling. And so I can kind of tell that might have come from her childhood. I didn't know her to pull such pranks like that, but anyway. All right, so that was some of the warm and happier memories, or depending on who you are in the story, maybe not if you're my grandmother's cousin, but anyways, back to the tape that I watched of my grandmother. One of the first questions that the interviewer asked her is, "What's your earliest memory?" And she said, "One of my earliest memories is of Borșa, my village, being burnt down by the Iron Guard, which was an anti-Semitic fascist Romanian group. They burnt down much of the town, but thankfully her house was spared. So this was a violent anti-Semitic attack. When my grandmother was around 13 years old, Hungary actually occupied Transylvania. And this is in about 1940. So my grandmother's 13. And the Hungarian troops came into the town, and they needed lodging. Their soldiers needed someplace to stay, right? So they saw my grandmother's big, beautiful house, and they said, that's a great place. We're just going to stay right in there. So these soldiers occupied the house, and they forced my grandmother and her family, I guess, into a smaller part of the house. And this was heartbreaking for the family. I mean, they were made to feel like strangers in their own home. And one of the wildest parts of this interview that my grandmother says, the interviewer asks her, "Oh, how did these soldiers treat you? Were they mean?" And my grandmother says, "No, not really. Well, they were indifferent to us. They called us dirty Jew." Wow, Grandma, that's what indifference looks like to you. Oh my goodness. Okay, so anyway, around this time, the Jewish children were kicked out of secular schools. Now, my grandmother had been going to secular school. She had non-Jewish friends at the school. They all got along, but they weren't allowed to go to school anymore. Also around this time, there was a law passed that said that Jews had to keep their businesses open on Shabbat, the Jewish day of rest, Friday, Saturday. Now, my grandfather, or my great-grandfather, I suppose, I think Nelly's father, who ran the store, refused to shut the general store, and so it had to close. It was shut down. At the time, Lily's parents, Nelly and Eliezer Meyer, and grandparents knew a little bit about what was happening elsewhere in Europe to the Jewish people. They knew that there was some forced labor that Jews were doing in Poland, but they really spoke about this in hushed tones, and my grandmother said she didn't know very much. Also around this time, a maid, so my family employed a maid. She said to Nelly and Eliezer Meyer, "You know, I'm not Jewish. They're not going to come after me. I can hide your children for you in the mountains." And I think they really debated over this question, but at the end of the day, they didn't want to separate from their kids. They, you know, everything was very uncertain and very scary, but I think the worst thing for them would be to leave the kids and not know what happened to them. So they stayed with the kids, and this was unfortunately a decision that they would very much come to regret. In March 1944, Germany occupied Hungary, and at this time the Germans were losing the war big time. And yet Hitler felt it was important to focus resources on trying to murder every last Jew in Europe. I guess his thinking was, well, we might not be able to defeat the Allied powers and the Russians, but at least we can fulfill the final solution to the Jewish question, which is basically a Nazi euphemism for a genocide of all the Jewish people. And I must mention as well, not only Jews were targeted during the Holocaust, as well disabled folks, queer people, Afro-Germans, because there were people in Germany with African descent, political dissidents. They were all targeted, and many of them faced the same fate as the Jews during the Holocaust. So in April 1944, my grandmother was 17 years old, and they were taken to a ghetto. So the ghetto that they were taken to happened to be just, I don't know how many kilometers, not too far away from Borsha. My mom and I actually had the chance to visit the town as well. They happened to have cousins in the town where the ghetto was being made, so they were able to live with the cousins for a while in the ghetto. So just little background information on the ghetto and why the Nazis created a ghetto. It was part of their strategy, right? Okay, they thought, if we can round up all the Jews and put them into a very crowded, cramped space, then it would be easier for us once we want to send them away to death camps, to concentration camps, because they're already in such crowded environments, we can just quickly put them on the trains and send them away. And that is what they did. A few details about what happened in the ghetto. My grandmother said they were forced to wear the yellow star on their jackets. There was a curfew. They weren't allowed to be out after a certain hour. There were regular beatings. It was very crowded. My grandmother said that she would hear Hungarian soldiers saying things to Jewish people like, "We are going to get rid of you." Now, in other parts of Europe, earlier on in the war, Jews would stay in the ghetto for months, sometimes even years at a time. But since the Russians were getting really close, this is right almost the end of the war, the Nazis had no time to waste in getting the Jews out into the concentration camps. So my family actually only stayed in the ghetto in Lieu for 1 month. This is one of the most tragic details of this story, but only a few months later, the Russians actually arrived to the part of Romania where my family is from, to Transylvania. So had it just been the difference of a few months, my family might have been spared. I'm just realizing that I completely forgot to mention the two younger siblings, Yehuda and Blima. I'll explain what happened to them in a moment, but we don't have any pictures of them. They were 2 and 4 years younger than my grandmother, I believe, or maybe a little bit more. So next thing that happened was they were rounded up and put onto cattle cars and taken away from the ghetto and to Auschwitz. In the cattle cars, they had no water, no food for 2 days. And my grandmother said, at this point, we felt like this was the end of us, for us as a family. They felt like they knew something really, really bad was going to happen. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go back to the slide for one moment. So at this time in the cattle cars, everyone is there in this picture except for Joseph. Joseph had been sent away to do forced labor in the Hungarian army, as did my grandfather. So my grandfather and Joseph were not in concentration camps, but we still call them Holocaust survivors because they still face horrible, horrible, horrible conditions during the war. So it's Nellie, Lasermeyer, Sarah, Bill, I believe, unless he may have been sent away to do forced labor too. I'm not 100% sure. I have to ask my family. We can ask them during the Q&A after. Some of them are here. Lilly, Yehuda, Blima were all sent to Auschwitz. So when they arrived at Auschwitz, there were 2 lines, and this is these infamous 2 lines. So one line was where children, old people, people who were disabled, people who weren't physically fit were sent. And then the other line was for younger, healthier, stronger people. Now the line for children and older people, my grandmother's youngest 2 siblings, Yehuda and Blima, were sent to that line. And my great-grandmother, Nellie, went after them. They didn't want to, oh, my mom just replied, Bill went to Auschwitz with the rest of the family. So, okay, thanks, Mom, for the details. So, okay, in that case, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 family members there in Auschwitz. So anyway, my grandmother wanted to follow Yehuda, Blima, and her mother, who were on the line for people who were weak or who couldn't work. Now Sarah saw my grandmother going on that line, and she pulled her right off of it. Sarah, this was the first time Sarah saved my grandmother's life. Sarah was super, super sharp and had really strong intuition. She pulled her off that line, and that was the last time that Lily and Sarah ever saw Yehuda, Blima, and my grandmother ever again. Because they were, if you're not familiar, what happened at Auschwitz and many other concentration camps is that the Nazis would send people who were unfit to work into gas chambers where they were, there was a toxic gas was released, and so when they breathed it in, they would be killed. So now Sarah and Lily are together, and it's just the 2 of them. Actually, I'm going to go back to this slide for a moment. So my mom and I had the chance to visit Auschwitz, and we had a little memorial there. We went actually with a group of people who also were from the same region that my grandmother was from, other Jewish people. And we had a little ceremony there, and we lit candles. So this is the train tracks. I'm not sure it's the exact train tracks on which my family arrived, but certainly would be quite similar. So actually, I'll pause for a moment and just explain this map. So this is kind of the journey. If you're not familiar with Eastern Europe, and honestly, I wasn't until I started researching this story, because I just learned in American school, I learned Western Europe history. So Borša, you'll see, is labeled here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it's in the north part of Romania, Ukrainian border. So they were taken from Borša to Vișu, which is really quite close by, Vișu de Sus, which is where the ghetto was. Then they went by cattle car all the way to Auschwitz. And then, as I'll explain later, my grandmother and her sister went to Stutthof, which is right in the north of Poland, that red pin. That's where another concentration camp where they went. So it's quite a long journey, as you can see. So I like to show a nice picture of Sarah and my grandmother while I talk about all the horrible things that they went through, because at the end of the day, they were human beings, real, amazing, beautiful, wonderful people. And so I like to show them, as the beautiful people that they were. And I like these pictures of them very much. So anyway, where did we leave off? So Sarah and Lily are together at Auschwitz, right? They just survived the selection, and the two of them are alive. Now, at this point, everything was taken from them. Their heads were shaved. They have this beautiful, thick hair. I have like kind of the same, like really thick hair, thick eyebrows. My sister also has the same super thick hair, gorgeous. Shaved it all off, right? Like one way of dehumanizing them, among many others. Their clothes were taken. They were given these like striped dresses, and they were sent into the camp. So in the camp, they were only there for about 4 weeks, but it was really, really horrible. Every morning they had a call. My grandmother called it the appel, and they would have to stand in a very straight line, and the Nazis would inspect them and see, who looks sick, who's maybe not behaving. So my grandmother said, maybe if you talked when you were supposed to be quiet, you would be singled out. All those people were kind of weeded out and taken away to the gas chambers. So of course, Sarah already, we know, is super smart, super intuitive. She kind of knows how to survive, right? So she said to my grandmother every morning, okay, we're going to pinch your cheeks so they look a little bit more red, so you have a little bit more life, so you look healthy, and stand really still. Again, my grandmother's 4 years younger than Sarah. I'm actually not sure if I mentioned this before. She's 4 years younger than Sarah. So Sarah is like becoming her mom right now. She's older sister, but she's her mom. She's taking care of her. She's saving her life time and time again. So there was not much for them to do at Auschwitz, actually. They didn't have any work. I think she probably had some horrible nightmares at the time, not knowing, exactly what happened to her family, but probably having some kind of feeling that she would never see them again. After 1 month in Auschwitz, they were taken to a labor camp in northern Poland, as you saw on the map before, called Stutthof. Maybe I'll just show it again for a moment. So all the way up in the Baltic Sea is where they went next. So they were in Stutthof from, I believe, August through January or February or so. So in Stutthof, they were housed in barracks. There was like wooden shacks. They were given a very thin blanket. Again, it's Poland. It's really, really, really cold. So this is not enough to really keep warm. Every morning, my grandma said they had this same kind of roll call, the appel, at 6 a.m. Then they got breakfast, which she said was a very small piece of bread, maybe a bit of watery coffee, and then they had to go to work. So my grandmother worked in a munitions factory where she made grenades, and she said that the chemicals turned her skin blue. And they had no color in their skin anymore. Sarah worked there in the factory with her for a little while, and then she, because again, she's super smart, she figured out how she could volunteer in the hospital at the camp, because she knew that if she worked there, she would be able to get a little bit more food. Again, this wasn't really much. It was watery soup, maybe, and little bits of bread for herself and for my grandmother. She would come home at night or come home right back to the barracks and bring my grandmother a little bit of extra food. My grandmother was still growing, probably. She was about only 17, and Sarah was a little older, so my grandmother probably needed a little bit more. So again, just one of the many ways that Sarah saved her life. My grandmother described life as really awful in general there. She said you might ask for something or turn your head to talk to someone and you would be beaten up or sometimes even killed. The situation was so desperate at the time. It was kind of hard to imagine that it could get any worse, but it did. In January of 1945, January, cold, middle of the winter, super cold, right? Not just like, you know, New York State winter, like Poland winter, really, really cold. Nazis were struggling big time. My grandmother said they heard bombardments and planes flying overhead. They stopped going to work, actually. And the Nazis decided that they would evacuate all of the prisoners out of the camps and march them on what would be called the Death March. And so I think the idea here was that, in part, that the Nazis would, in taking the Jews away from the concentration camps, they would kind of destroy evidence of what they had been doing to the Jewish people. So they thought, okay, we're going to just march them until they kind of all drop dead. It's the middle of the winter. Lilly and Sarah were rounded up alongside, she said, about 800, maybe 1,000 people at the camp. And so now they're really fighting to stay alive against all odds: cold, hunger, thirst, sleep deprivation. All they're wearing is their striped prison dress. Against the harsh wind and freezing temperature, this was not very good. She said she felt her legs and hands literally beginning to freeze. You know, at Stutthof, that there was nothing nice about the barracks, but at least they had something to sleep on, a horizontal surface to lie down on. And now they didn't have anything. They just were forced to keep walking and walking. Every time they felt that they were too tired to keep going, they would remind themselves of what would happen if they stopped. Occasionally, they would hear the pop of a shotgun, which was you know, Nazis shooting the weak people dead in the snow. So she and Sarah fought with any remaining energy they possibly had to keep moving, one foot in front of the other, and they were marching like this for 2 days. Again, Sarah's smarts come in. She's super clever. The guards at one moment hadn't been near them for a little while. Sarah was really hoping that there would be somewhere to run in the distance before they came close by again. And by some miracle, she had this moment. Sarah saw a farmhouse in the distance and she said to my grandmother, okay, this is our chance. We can't go any further. Either they're gonna kill us or we're gonna die like this. So let's just try. Let's go run to that barn. So they hobbled toward the barn and were able to open the door. There were big bales of hay in the corner, and so they figured, okay, we can go and hide and rest there. Eventually, the woman who owned the house, and in the interview tape, my grandmother calls her the lady of the house. The lady of the house came out to feed the animals or whatever, and Sarah approached her. She mustered up the courage to say, hey, lady, the Russians are close. You know, if you help us, if you give us some food, the Russians will help you. The war is coming to an end. And the woman said, you know, we're actually hiding wounded German soldiers in this house. They might come and they might try to kill you or hurt you if we let you in. And Sarah said, well, you know, if you're hiding them, they must be wounded. I speak good German. I can help you in the house. They don't have to know I'm Jewish. If I help you, maybe you can give me and my sister a little bit of food. The woman agreed. So my grandmother hid in the barn while Sarah worked in the house. She was afraid of the Nazis in the house. She was afraid that they would hurt her. And she tried to believe that what Sarah told her, that they weren't really a threat, that that they would be okay. A few days later, they heard the stomp of soldiers approaching the barn. And the lady of the house, as my grandmother called her, said, come down, the Russians are here. Okay, so this part, hang in with me because this is really chaotic. As war is chaotic, this scene is especially chaotic. So the Russian soldiers are coming in and they just start shooting at everyone in the barn. And there were other people hiding in there too as well. So there's just total chaos. They think that maybe Sarah and Lily are German. They're just kind of indiscriminately shooting. And so my grandmother and Sarah, they knew how to say the word Jew in Russian. So they thought if we scream Jew, Jew, like, no, we're Jewish, they would stop shooting. So the soldiers somehow didn't understand. They might not have even spoken Russian. My grandmother thought that they might have been from Mongolia. I'm not sure. Anyway, finally, the captain of the soldiers kind of heard what Lily and Sarah were saying, we're Jews, don't shoot us. And he ordered his soldiers to stop shooting. And he actually told them, hey, I'm Jewish too. He didn't speak too much Yiddish, which is the language that Lily and Sarah spoke, and as well as other languages, but they didn't have, Yiddish was the common language that they spoke. They couldn't communicate too well, but well enough for him to say, we're sorry, we didn't mean to, we didn't know, you can't stay here, we're gonna help you, I'm gonna take you to a safe place, but you can't stay here, you might be raped or killed. And so at this point, this man saved them. I mean, at that point, my grandmother said she felt like she was half dead. She thought she weighed maybe 75 or 80 pounds. But finally, she was safe. This Russian captain brought them to a hospital. Slowly, they got better. Actually, just a side note, they're really, really lucky that they were taken to a hospital, because a lot of times people who survived concentration camps, they died after the war from just eating normal food. You had to really, really work your system up very slowly to eat food again. And a lot of times those who survived ate too much too quickly and died because their system couldn't handle it. But they were so lucky that they were taken to a hospital where they could properly, reintroduce food to their system. So that they survived. So while they got better and stronger, they started to feel, okay and could function again. So they started to actually work in the hospital, helping out. They made beds, they helped in the kitchen, they changed bandages. They were there for about 2 months. This was around February to April or so. Actually, that's not 2 months, but sometime in the spring, late winter, spring. At that point, they decided we have to go home. Maybe our parents are there or somebody would be home. So they went home and they found their dad there. Laser Meyer was there. He was very surprised to see that Sarah and Lily had made it. He didn't think that they would make it. I don't think that they thought that he would make it. And they all reunited in this big, beautiful house. And actually, the house was already filled with some people, with other Jews that had survived. They lived actually for a little while, like a big community in the house. About 20 survivors stayed all together in the house. My grandmother said that around every day they would hear news that more people had survived. Most people, again, were of course really sick and had to get well before they could make it back to Borsha. So sometimes it took a little while. Eventually, about 300 people came back. And before the war, there were 2,200 Jews in Borsha before the war. So that means that about 80% of the Jews from Borsha were murdered. And so naturally, as you might imagine, this was very painful. My grandmother said, I didn't want to stay in Borsha anymore. There's nothing there left for me. I want to leave. Her older brother Bill, had left to go to Germany, and Lily wanted to go with him. And Laser Meyer, her dad, said, no, young lady, you will not go alone to Germany. if you want to go to Germany, you have to get married. And she said, okay. So it just so happens that around 1946, July or so, she went to the big city in the region, which is called Siget, which is where my grandfather is from, which is also well known because that's where Elie Wiesel, the famous writer, was from as well. And my side note, my grandfather grew up knowing Elie Wiesel. Anyways, my grandmother goes to Siget to visit a cousin. And I think that she had taken out a loan, or her family had taken out a loan from my grandfather's family, something along those lines. But my grandmother's cousin, who introduced her to my grandfather, whose name is Alan, said, don't worry, when you see this debtor, you're going to forgive her debt because she's so beautiful. So 3 months later, they were married in Borscha, I believe. Just after 3 months, then they were able to go to Germany. So at the time, Germany seems like a kind of funny place for two Holocaust survivors to go, right? But actually, they went to Munich, which was occupied by the Americans. They didn't have a passport, they didn't have papers, they didn't have anything. They smuggled their way to Germany. So this is a pretty unbelievable detail, but at the time, there was a housing crisis. There wasn't enough places to live. So people were being forced to give up, half their apartment or whatever it was to accommodate those who needed housing. So this was the case for my grandmother and my grandfather. So they lived with a German couple, and the man here in the picture, this is the couple with my grandmother. The man had been a professor in a university, and he actually told her something along these lines. He said, I want you to know I was a member of the Nazi Party. I was a professor at the university, and I couldn't have kept my job if I didn't do that. He said, I feel so terribly. You seem like very nice people. He said, we lost 3 sons in the war. We had a really hard time. So my grandmother said she actually kind of felt bad for these people. They had lost 3 children. It seemed like they didn't know the extent of what was being done to the Jewish people during the war. So my grandmother was nice to them. She gave them coffee, she gave them food, and they kind of got along quite well. I mean, this picture is so remarkable to me. Like, they all look, my grandmother's smiling in this picture with this German couple. Post-war Germany, there was lots of smuggling going on. Bill and my grandpa Alan, they would do things like selling cigarettes. They made, money off of little things like that, black market stuff. And remember, these people are like in their young 20s, so they just experienced a horrible trauma. They were like, okay, let's just forget about it for a moment. Like, let's have fun. We can party, we can drink, we can dance. And so I have this amazing photo album filled with all these pictures of that time. And there's pictures of them like at I guess maybe like a lake or something. They're all in their bathing suits. There's pictures of them at parties with like streamers. And it's really, it's a pretty incredible thing. Quickly, let's see. Yeah, so when my grandmother was living in Germany, somehow she was able to get this this temporary travel document in lieu of passport. So this is her document. She signed her name, Leah Gutmann, at the bottom. I think this is just so incredible. It says, for persons of undetermined nationality. She was a stateless person at this time. She used this to travel around Europe a little bit before she was able to come to the United States with my grandfather. So in May of 1951, my grandmother and my grandfather came to the US. My grandfather had an uncle who was already in the US who was able to sponsor them. This is just a picture of them around that time. They had to be healthy to come into the US. They had to pass medical examinations. At the time, of course, my grandparents were refugees. They had no place to go, right? So where could they go? they could basically, there was two choices of where might accept them. It was either the US, maybe Israel. Some Jews also went to Australia. There were other places, South America, that Jews went, but kind of the options for them was either Israel or the US. So actually Sarah went to Israel, and some other members of the family went to Israel. Joseph as well. But Bill ended up going to the US. My grandfather actually was denied entry into Israel because he didn't pass the medical test. So they ended up going to the US, and they built a new life in the Bronx. When they arrived, my grandfather's uncle got an apartment for them, helped them find work. Of course, they didn't speak any English. By the way, these people spoke so many languages. My grandparents spoke Yiddish, they spoke Hungarian, they spoke Romanian, they spoke eventually English, French. My grandfather grew up learning. They spoke so many languages, but English wasn't one of them when they first arrived to the US. So it was very hard. They went to school at night. My grandfather got a job in the garment industry, and my grandmother initially worked in a bow tie factory. Living in the Bronx, they had my mother, baby Shelly. It took her about 10 years for her to get pregnant. She was so excited when finally my mother was born. So my mom grew up in the Bronx, which was pretty diverse, a lot of immigrants, a lot of other Jews. But in the 50s, there was this government policy of redlining. So families like my family were able to move to the suburbs and into bigger, nicer homes and away from the city. I think when my mom started, when she was about 10, 11, 12 years old, that neighborhood started getting violent. There was violence in school, and it didn't feel safe anymore. So they left and they went to the suburbs. So again, this is just really unbelievable to me, because the United States is and has always been such a segregated and racialized country, where Black people have always been at the lowest. So Black people were not did not benefit from this policy. They were continued to be segregated in the cities, and weren't afforded the kind of government loans or insurance that was offered to families like mine in the suburbs. So they were able to benefit from this, and they were able to live a nicer life. They moved to Paramus, New Jersey, and they worked kind of like working class jobs, but they were able to build good credit and retire nicely. They also got reparations from Germany, and so they were able to, when I knew them, they lived quite comfortably. They had a nice apartment. I would have never known like kind of the conditions that they lived in their younger years. So back to my grandmother and her career a little bit. So she ended up moving away from the bow tie factory and ended up becoming a saleswoman. She worked at again, you can maybe see from these pictures, she was a fashionista, right? She like has these amazing outfits, always, dressed to the nines. And she was a great saleswoman. She worked grabbing like suits for men in a menswear department. She would like take one look at a guy and find the perfect suit for him. And she was just amazing at it. She stayed very close with her manager for many years. I even met him. She worked at Daffy Dan's, which is a department store that doesn't exist anymore. My grandmother was this huge personality, very happy, always had this enormous smile on her face, loved to cook. She would make these elaborate dinner parties with so many courses, and she would serve in like china and crystal, and it was always so grand. And that's how I grew up. I grew up visiting her. My grandmother and my grandfather moved to Florida, and I would go there and visit them every year. This is a picture of me as a baby visiting them in Florida. This is around the time that she made, and my grandfather as well actually also made a Showa tape, those interview tapes. My grandmother always said to me, You know, I'll be happy as long as I live to see you get your bat mitzvah. So when I was 13 years old, I had if you don't know, it's like a Jewish coming of age ceremony. When I was 13, I had this big party, and my grandmother was lucky enough to get to see it, and my little sisters as well. So that's my little sister and my grandmother and I at my bat mitzvah. So, oh my goodness, what can I say to close out? This is my grandmother again. Something that she said at the end of her interview with the Shoah Foundation. She said, many nights we'd have nightmares. We wake up in the middle of the night. It never leaves you. It lives with you on a daily basis. There isn't a day I don't think about what I went through, or my family, or my friends. It's something that you never forget. And me, I feel like for my part, I can never forget. It's affected me as we've kind of touched on in the intro in so many ways. I think a lot of the trauma that she went through was passed down to me in big and some small ways. And I feel like I have this obligation to share this story, because nobody should have to experience anything even close to what my grandmother did. So I feel that this is my duty to share. Yeah. Thank you for all listening. I'd love to accept questions if you have any.
Emily, thank you so much for gifting us with your family story. And thank you also for your social consciousness and your activism. It really is significant from descendants of Holocaust survivors to speak about these issues. So about the Q&A, we're now going to open it up for questions. If you have a question for Emily, please type it into the Q&A and we'll do our best to get to it. Just so everyone knows, due to the high volume of questions we typically receive at these events, we won't be able to get to every single one. If your question isn't addressed tonight, please email info@3gnewyork.org. New York is spelled out, and we will relay the question to Emily. So thank you for understanding. And let's go to the first question. Just a quick comment. Emily, you look like your grandmother, so that's a very nice sentiment. It was also great seeing those photos. It's amazing you have those. Gonna ask question from the other the panelists. Oh, can you talk more about the book that you're writing?
Yes. So, okay. Everything I just said to you, that there's a lot. That was all a lot, right? And there's a lot more, obviously. So we do this training program to tell this story. Should I leave the slide like this, or should I X out of it? Let me know what you think. Anyways, I did this program about 2 years ago, and not long after, I went to Romania, and I went to Poland, and I saw it with my own eyes. And there was just so much to say. I felt like there was a book there. Like I had to record this in a more like in a way that could be preserved. And so I decided, I took a couple of writing courses this year to write a bit of her story, as well as my experience traveling in Eastern Europe and my experience researching the story. So ideally this book will turn out to be, or at least I imagine it to be, kind of part my memoir, my memories of my grandmother, my experience of intergenerational trauma, my anxiety that I think has something to do with this trauma, and part biography of her. I really want to share what I've learned about my grandmother, as well as, all my really warm, loving memories of her. I noticed someone asked specifically about what it means, how this trauma gets passed down. For me, it looks like anxiety, people pleasing, always feeling like I have to impress people, feeling like I have to work really hard to prove myself. And I think this relates to this idea of like, okay, if I work really hard, then maybe I'll be spared because I'll be seen as someone who's, valuable or who's liked or whatever it is. And so I think that this is something it's not unique to, survivors or descendants of survivors. I think that's something that many oppressed peoples experience, like this feeling that you need to, because the world is so against you, this feeling that you need to prove yourself. But for me, I think it was something that I took like to an extreme where I felt like in school, I felt like I had to get A's in every class, like nothing less than an A was ever acceptable for me. And I was very, very high strung. I wasn't able to calm down. I wasn't able to chill out, I think my nervous system is really quite dysregulated. And this is common for people who experience trauma. In a very basic sense, our nervous systems have two general modes. I mean, there's more, but there's like the fight or flight version, and then there's the rest and digest. And so for people who experience trauma, often they'll be stuck in that fight or flight. So I have like low grade anxiety. I'm always like, I'm a very jumpy person. I'm often stuck in that fight or flight kind of way of being. It's hard for me to tap into like that rest and digest way of being. It also has to do with, I have so many gut issues, which makes sense because like my body doesn't like to chill and just let myself digest. So anyways, a lot of this I have uncovered through therapy, I've done an intensive yoga asana, like physical practice, physical posture, as well as meditation training. I've done somatic work. I've done embodiment work, like all kinds of help, which I'm so fortunate to have been able to access, which has helped me realize all these things because, yeah, for sure, I would not have come to these conclusions on my own.
I have a question. Can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
So what was it like for you to go back to where your grandparents were from, where your grandma was from? Because I know personally, I went back to Poland with my dad many years ago, and just to stand in the footsteps where my grandmother and grandfather lived was just, it gave chills down my spine. So I want to know if you had similar experience and what you felt, and if I'm assuming that'll be in your book as well.
Yeah, so, I forgot to say, so I'm applying for MFAs in creative nonfiction right now because I want to write this story, but I want to do it as compelling of a way as possible and write it as beautifully as possible. So I'm aiming to kind of start studying like syntax and all that kind of, I don't know, like structure, how to do it in a kind of creative way that makes it sound compelling. So I can read a little excerpt of what I've already written, if that sounds good, about my experience going back to the post office. Sure.
Please.
So you've seen the picture of the post office. I kind of explained a little bit there. So I've never been so happy to see a post office. My mom and I arrived at the beginning of my grandmother's story, a village called Borșa in Marmaris County, Romania, nestled in the Carpathian Mountains. Oh my God, this is it. This is the house. My mother's smile burst open in an elated disbelief, catching the printout picture of the post office from Google Maps. It was solidly there, real, right in front of us. It looks just like it did in both pictures, the one from Google Maps and in Grandma's picture. She's visited in the 1970s, over 20 years after she had left Romania for good, and found that her home had become a post office. In the photo, she stands by the front door marked Posta. She's wearing a brown trench coat and carrying a leather handbag. She squints in the sunlight, a slight smile on her face. Was she happy she'd found the house, that it was still standing? Proud she'd once lived in such a stately home? Or was she just smiling for the camera? Or smiling to conceal her indignation? This building, which had nested her warm and loving family, remained, occupied by a government that had stood by as that warm and loving family was rounded up by the Hungarians, ghettoized in a nearby village, and thrust upon Auschwitz-bound cattle cars. Smile through, smile through. No room for anger here. No room for Jewishness here. Certainly no room for an angry Jewish woman here. 40 years later, this remains true. We entered the post office, which was clearly a post office. A big brown desk dotted with government-issued signage occupied the middle of the room. 3 patrons waited in line, clutching their packages and letters. My mother and I were accompanied by a guide, an atypical Romanian, because she's obsessed with Jews, even though she's not Jewish herself. She served as our interpreter and approached the manager of the post office. She communicated with the woman in Romanian, explaining, "I'm here with these people who are visiting because this post office is where their mother and grandmother grew up. It used to be their family home. They've traveled a long way and would like to see it. It's a very important place to them. Would it be okay if we just looked in the back or upstairs?" The woman, perhaps in her mid-40s, short sandy hair and simply dressed, appeared stone cold from the moment she began, Alina, our guide, began speaking, and remained so throughout her explanation of our unique request. "You cannot come in any further. It is forbidden." I wasn't there. Or technically my body was, but everything else wasn't. A full body freeze. I could see the room, but somehow I was severed from the place I'd found myself in. I had to be, to follow the woman's rules. We peered around and Alina explained what might have been where in the house where my family lived there. The kitchen would have been back there. She pointed through a small window cut out in the wall. The dining room would have been here. She gestured underneath our feet. I know because it's near the window that faces the street. That's where families would have had their big Shabbat dinners with any guests that came by. And you see this beautiful molding in the corner? That looks original. This house is so well preserved. It's really remarkable. For me, it felt like touring a museum with a docent, but it was so hard to imagine what she was saying being real. I couldn't picture it at all. I couldn't smell the mama liga or the cheesy potato soup that my great-grandmother would have cooked. I couldn't see the lacquered black bookshelf that housed Hebrew books, or hear the sounds of my grandmother and her siblings shuffling about and giggling as they played pranks on each other. I didn't allow myself to get near this anger because I'd buried it so deep inside, because it was not allowed here. The lady said we couldn't explore the house, so we couldn't explore the house. Nothing to be done about it. Our guide explained it's common for Romanians to become wary when Jewish people with Romanian ancestry visit. The Romanians worry that these visitors will try to take their homes away from them to reclaim what was lost. Yet, of course, this practically never happens. Jewish people aren't so safe in Eastern Europe, where anti-Semitism remains widespread. Weeks before our visit, the home of Elie Wiesel, a famous Holocaust survivor and scholar from the main city in Marmaris County, Siget, was vandalized with a swastika. People like me don't want to move to Romania to live. We just want to see what was there before.
Emily, another question regarding your WEDU experience. Can you share what you learned about yourself through WEDU?
Yeah, so I think I had never really imagined myself presenting this story. I don't know how I would have had the support to put it all together if not for WEDU, to actually take the time to sit down and write it all down and present it, to be connected to schools. That was just absolutely incredible and taught me that I can share this story. And honestly, I don't know if I would have even considered writing this book that I'm now working on writing if the thought, I feel like that experience sort of planted this idea in my head, oh, you can actually do this. And another thing that was really amazing to me about WEDU was that I was able to connect with other people who have the same identity, the 3G, third generation survivor identity. We could bonded over these things that you know, I think all of us kept hidden, like, oh, your family hoarded food too, or like, oh, you were afraid growing up that your parents would just die in a car crash and never come home. Like, oh, you also read all the Holocaust themed like young adult novels you could find. I mean, all of these experiences I had personally, and I never really spoke about them to anybody because I didn't think anybody would get it, or I didn't think that they were, I don't know, it was just very dark stuff. And it was so liberating to connect with other people who had similar experiences, to say it aloud and be like, no, yeah, I know this. I know what you've experienced. I have the same identity.
So I think we need to cut it short. Well, not short. We went over a little, but I think we're going to stop now. There are so many questions. You guys will forward them on to Emily so she can answer for you. Or if there are questions directed to 3GNY, we'll be more than happy to answer them. Emily, thank you so much for speaking tonight and for sharing your grandmother's story and about your book and about your experience and your transgenerational trauma and your healing. And thanks to all the viewers out there. Thanks for coming wherever you are in the world. Thanks for joining us this evening. We're so glad you took the time out of your evening or morning, wherever you are, to hear Emily tell her grandma's story, and just so that we may never forget any of our family stories. Just please remember, if you haven't made a gift to support our educational programs, we hope you'll consider making one now. I believe in the chat. Oh, I've never done that. In the chat, you can find a link to donate. And if you have any connections with any educators who may want our speakers to speak in their classrooms, please get in touch with us. We have lots of fabulous speakers who love donating their time to get our message out. Just let you guys know, we have some virtual events coming up. As I mentioned, we have our WEDU Wednesdays every two weeks. On October 28th, we have Elizabeth Kamens, who will share her grandfather's fascinating story. He escaped Germany after Kristallnacht and ultimately joined the US Army, where he was sent back to Europe to fight against the Germans, and was part of the troops that landed on the beaches of Normandy, which is another special story because I have a great uncle who did that as well. He wasn't in the Holocaust, but stormed the beaches of Normandy, and he actually liberated my grandfather. And I can't wait to hear it. Let's see, tomorrow evening, October 15th, 3GNY and 3GDC are hosting Confronting and Undoing Racism with Care from a Jewish Perspective, featuring Yehuda Webster, a community organizer for Jews for racial and economic justice. There's space available if you want to attend. And on Sunday, October 25th at 4 p.m., author Adina Ostrowski, who wrote Living Among the Dead, will be joining us to discuss the story of a remarkable young woman's unimaginable journey through the rise of the Nazi regime, World War II and its aftermath. Manya Lichtenstein's story of survival is narrated by her granddaughter, and her memories are interwoven with poetry and personal reflection. We'll be sending out an email tomorrow with all the details of everything I just mentioned and with registration links, as well as a recording of tonight's program so you could share with friends and family who may have missed it this evening. As I mentioned earlier, feel free to check out 3GNY's YouTube channel. All of our prior recordings are in there. We encourage you to share with, again, your friends and family. And again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to be here with us. Have a lovely evening, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.